Namaskar and welcome to World Connect, your weekly dose and one-stop destination for all that you need to know about major or perhaps plain interesting developments the world over. From events that leave a mark and have the potential to influence and change the course of geopolitics to happenings in the world of films, music, art, culture and much more. And what really makes this show different from others of the same ilk is that it will represent nearly all regions of the world. As and when there is something newsworthy and interesting in a continent, trust us to tell you about it in such times when most news shows are swamped by domestic developments. I'm Sakal Bhatt and we will present a democratic and truly representative picture of global developments. Let's set the ball rolling with the focus of the show. Coming up first. UNSC discusses Israel-Palestine crisis as tension simmers, claiming several lives from both sides. Report by Dutch authorities on Malaysian aircraft MH17 tries to explain the crash that claimed 298 lives on board. In the run-up to Paris summit on climate change next month, Latin American leaders demand bigger burden sharing from rich nations. And being a woman on and behind camera is the essence of this year's London Film Festival, as the event highlights works of women filmmakers with screening of films from 72 nations. We begin the show with escalating Israeli-Palestinian conflict in West Asia. Palestinians torched a Jewish holy site in the West Bank city of Nablus amid soaring tensions with Israel. It came hours after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called on the Palestinian leadership to stop a wave of attacks.
Voices calling for international intervention in Palestine becoming louder amid heightening tension in Jerusalem following the killing of over 30 Palestinians. Israeli forces launched major security operation in Arab areas of the city to counter reported stabbing attempts by Palestinians. There was a surge in attacks despite setting up several checkpoints. Israel began to seal off Palestinian neighborhoods and deployed security forces in major areas. The move followed a decision by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's security cabinet to take aggressive measures to quell a month-long unrest. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas slammed Israel's decision, accusing it of killing Palestinians in cold blood.
We will not accept the continuation of the current situation in occupied Palestine. We will not give in to the logic of using power and aggressive policy of the occupation that the Israeli government is implementing.
Israeli authorities claimed that several Israelis have been killed and dozens wounded in shooting and stabbing attacks since the beginning of October.
Israel is using exactly the kind of legitimate and the amount of legitimate force that any one of those governments and those municipalities and those police forces would use if they had people wielding knives, meat cleavers, axes, trying to kill people on their streets.
Concerned over the crisis, the US has labeled attacks from both sides as acts of terrorism. Secretary of State John Kerry is also expected to visit the region soon in a bid to ease tensions. The raging violence has been a result of Palestinian fears about increased visits by Jewish groups to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is among the holiest sites in Islam. Jews also consider the site as their place of deep faith. Jews are allowed to visit the place but cannot worship there. Despite Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledging to maintain the current status quo, Palestinians are apprehensive that the visits of Jewish radicals may mark the first stage of an eventual plan to partition the compound into Muslim and Jewish sections. The status quo is effective in Al-Aqsa since 1967 after Israel occupied East Jerusalem at the end of the Six-Day War. The upsurge in violence has also led some to warn of the risk of a third Palestinian intifada. Meanwhile, as the crisis deepens, concerns are growing amid calls for a solution as soon as possible.
Let's now shift our focus to Syrian crisis. 400 sorties hitting about 350 targets in a week. There seems to be no letdown of Russian airstrikes in Syria as it continued to pound militant hideout targets in Homs, Hama and Damascus. Joining the offensive, the Syrian army also unleashed its military operation in rebel-held towns north of the city of Homs and Aleppo. The offensive began after over a week of ground attacks launched with Russian air support in areas of western Syria crucial to President Bashar al-Assad's survival. Meanwhile, Iranian troops are also reportedly helping the Assad regime. And the latest that we have from conflict-ridden Afghanistan, the United States' decision to extend its military presence in Afghanistan beyond 2016 has been welcomed by the Afghanistan government. Afghanistan government says the move would help stability in Afghanistan. The US said on Thursday that it would maintain 5,500 troops in Afghanistan into early 2017, a shift from earlier plans to withdraw most by late 2016. And staying with news from Asia, the Iranian parliament has passed a bill on supporting a nuclear deal with world powers, signaling a victory for the government over conservative opponents of the agreement. With this move, the deck has been cleared for the implementation of the deal. Under the July 14 deal with the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia and China, Tehran accepted strict limitations on its nuclear program. While parts of West Asia continue to simmer in tension, China seems to be in a mood to strike a conciliatory note with Southeast Asian countries. In contrast to the earlier increasingly tense spat, China has said it is willing to hold joint drills in the disputed South China Sea with Southeast Asian countries, covering accidental encounters and search and rescue. Earlier, media reports claimed that the United States was considering to conduct patrols in South China Sea. After formation of a new government and promulgation of the constitution, Nepalese lawmakers elected the country's first woman Speaker of Parliament. Nepalese lawmakers elected Onsari Ghati Magar as country's first woman Speaker of Parliament. The country has recently got new government after Constituent Assembly was converted into the Legislative Parliament following promulgation of the constitution. KP Sharma Oli was elected as the new Prime Minister. In EuroEssence, we will take you through what all is making news in Europe. Well, over a year after Malaysian aircraft MH17 went down in conflict-ridden eastern Ukraine, the Dutch authorities have come out with a report. Though the report does not apportion blame on anyone in particular, but it attempts to answer what actually caused the crash.
This is what remains of the Malaysian plane MH17. The pieces painstakingly put together over a year after it crashed in the airspace over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 on board. The final reports released by the Dutch authorities explain what and how the plane went down, though stops short of specifying who.
MH17 crashed as a result of the detonation of a warhead outside the aeroplane, above the left-hand side of the cockpit. This warhead was of the 9N314M type, carried on the kind of missile that is installed on the Buk surface-to-air missile system.
It's believed the Buk missile is possessed by both the Russian and Ukrainian armies. The reactions and counter-reactions followed in quick. Moscow outrightly rejected the findings, saying the report was biased and politically motivated, further adding that the warheads mentioned in the report are no more part of its military. Blaming Russia for the crash, Ukraine said it was a planned operation of the Russian special services, though it defended not closing the airspace after the report said Kiev had sufficient reason to close the airspace over the conflict-torn region. Meanwhile, Netherlands urged Russia to cooperate, saying the priority now is to find and pursue those who are responsible, a view echoed by the United States. Malaysia too reiterated its commitment to bringing the perpetrators to justice. There can be as many conclusions, liability shifted, fixed, but those grieving for the loss of their loved ones, the pain is unending. The Malaysian flight MH17 en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur crashed over the territory held by pro-Russian rebels on 17 July 2014.
The European Union's deal with Turkey to stem the flow of migrants hasn't cut ice with Turkey. Deal looked shaky, with Ankara terming it as unacceptable. Turkey said the action plan agreed in Brussels is not final and merely a draft. The EU and Turkey had struck a deal on 16th, which was described as an action plan aimed at stemming a massive influx of migrants into the bloc. While Europe grapples hard to contain the escalating migrant crisis, Belarus re-elected country's strongman Alexander Lukashenko, who was once dubbed as Europe's last dictator by Washington.
Once dubbed as Europe's last dictator by Washington, Belarus re-elected country's strongman Alexander Lukashenko for a fifth presidential term. And this was not just a plain victory, it came with a bonus. Lukashenko's vote percentage rose to 83.5% as compared to 80% in 2010. Last polls were marked by widespread protests against his election. He even jailed prominent opposition figures. Lukashenko's leadership in Belarus earned his country a bad name in terms of civil and political rights globally. Country's rating for press freedom is also among the lowest. Despite all this discredit, he remained strong in his home turf and triumphed. International monitors, however, said the poll lacked democratic standards. 2015 Nobel Prize winner for literature Svetlana Alexievich, while expressing surprise on Lukashenko congratulating her for the honor, said that she did not expect any surprise in the elections. Lukashenko's country has long been sidelined by the West. Economic sanctions were imposed on some Belarusian officials and companies. But Lukashenko's efforts to project himself as a guarantor of stability ensured growing support for him. He also tried to impress West on the poll eve by saying he had done everything it wanted and nobody can prevent it. Lukashenko's criticism of Russia's annexation of Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula, his hosting of Ukraine peace talks, and pardoning opposition leaders were seen as efforts to improve his image. Belarus going cold on Russian plan to build an air base indicated some strain in ties with Russia. However, Lukashenko said that Moscow continues to be Minsk's closest friend.
We will remain a friendly country as we are now with Russia. This is a brotherly and the closest country to us, and you can be sure about it.
Lukashenko's efforts to woo the West turned fruitful, and the European Union decided to suspend sanctions, a much-needed step for Minsk. But an uphill task still follows Lukashenko as he begins his new term. Meeting the expectations from the West, dealing with pressure from Moscow and challenges for the economy, it's much more than just an electoral battle to win.
And to conclude the Euro Essence segment, how about enjoying the visuals of the chilling climes of Germany? Wintry chill took over much of Germany, with temperatures falling as low as -40 degrees Celsius in the center of the country. First up in News from America Chronicles, former Secretary of State and Democratic presidential hopeful Hillary Clinton scored extra points as she impressed with her performance in the first Democratic debate. Hillary Clinton, Senator Bernie Sanders and former Governor Martin O'Malley faced off in the debate, which turned out to be a Hillary and Bernie show. As the international community gears up to deliberate on the burning issues confronting climate change in Paris next month, Latin American leaders recently came together in Bolivia to discuss issues of disparity emanating from climate change and, most significantly, how to deal with the world's biggest polluters.
As the world community gears up to brainstorm a global pact next month in Paris to deal with climate change impact, Latin American leaders have demanded that developed countries take the lead in sharing greater burden. The left-leaning leaders gathered in Bolivia for a people's conference and discussed disparity generating climate change. Developed nations are responsible for almost 75% of greenhouse gas emissions, but greater burden is borne by the developing ones.
We are here to declare the technologies that mitigate the climate change and its respective effects as public global goods, guaranteeing free access.
Hosted by Bolivian President Evo Morales, conclusions drawn at the People's Conference will be presented in Paris.
In November and December, governments will meet in Paris to finalize an agreement on climate change. It must be ambitious, it must involve all the nations. There is no longer any time to delay.
The last big push for a world climate deal was in Copenhagen in 2009. It nearly ended in a fiasco after rich and poor countries bickered over how to share the burden. The Bolivian meeting took place as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank annual meetings wrapped up in Lima. Those talks also aimed to gather proposals and financial pledges for combating climate change. The world's richest nations have set a 2020 goal to raise $100 billion a year to help poor countries combat and adapt to climate change. According to a 2015 study, the Americas are among the countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It ranked 6 Latin American nations among the 20 most at risk from extreme weather conditions. Ahead of the Paris Climate Conference, 147 countries representing more than 80% of greenhouse gas emissions have already publicly presented what post-2020 climate actions they intend to put in practice. The Paris summit will aim at clinching a deal to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius.
Moving on, the UN General Assembly has elected Egypt, Japan, Senegal, Ukraine and Uruguay to serve as non-permanent members on the Security Council for 2-year terms. The term of these members will begin from 1st of January next year and will end on 31st of December 2017. And now let's get you some news from the political turf of Canada. Incumbent Prime Minister Stephen Harper faces a tough challenge in Canadian polls with a tight 3-way contest between his Conservative Party, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau and New Democratic Party leader Thomas Mulcair. Harper has been Prime Minister for almost 10 years and is hoping to become the first Canadian Prime Minister in more than 100 years to win a 4th term in office. And we conclude the America Chronicles with notes from Cuban band. The Buena Vista Social Club played at White House to mark the last day of National Hispanic Heritage Month.
Es un pedazo del alma que se arranca sin
In Afroscope, up first is news from Nigeria. Over 35 people have been killed in multiple suicide attacks in northeastern Nigeria's Borno state on Friday. State is the birthplace of the Boko Haram insurgency. Nearly 30 people were killed in another twin attack on Thursday on the outskirts of the state capital, Maiduguri. While Nigeria continues to grapple with militant strikes and suicide attacks, the United States is sending 300 troops along with surveillance drones to Cameroon to tackle militant group Boko Haram. US has made it clear that the deployment is for defense and not for combat. Nigeria has welcomed the move. In Human Touch this week, we bring to you the ever-inspiring story of Nick Vujicic. We trace the life of Vujicic, who proved that given a steely determination, nothing is impossible, even if you are born without arms and without legs, which is a rare disorder.
In an age where humans are racing against time and busy doing one or the other thing every moment, each second, just imagine doing it all without using hands or legs. eating without hands, walking without legs, writing without fingers and swimming without limbs? What if you are not able to embrace someone you love, or when fulfilling routine basic needs, it becomes a struggle for life? For most of us, it's unimaginable, impossible. But Nick Vujicic does it every single day. Born in Melbourne, in Australia in 1982, Nick was different from other children. He was born without arms or legs, the result of a rare disorder, tetraamelia syndrome. Nick's parents started coping with both the challenge and blessing of raising him. A son who set an example before others by not succumbing to the challenges posed by life, challenges for others but not for him. He struggled with depression and loneliness too, but his constant feeling that he was different from all the other children made him gain new strength and passion towards life. Nick now motivates many through his inspirational talks. He has traveled around the world, interacted with diverse groups in a number of countries, and shared his story with a message. He started his own non-profit organization, Life Without Limbs. Recently, Nick addressed students of a school in Ohio on bullying and its all too often ugly sequel, suicide. Encouraging the youngsters, he asked them to talk to teachers and guidance counselors when dealing with such problems. Nick is married with 2 children. An author, musician and actor, Nick passionately spends time for his hobbies of fishing, painting and swimming. He first gave a talk at the age of 19. Since then, there has been no looking back. Nick's journey is not just about how he overcame the struggles of his own life, but how one can find true meaning and purpose. It's about changing lives and touching hearts.
And in Showbuzz this week, the spotlight is on the London Film Festival, which this time around is all about women behind the camera and also women in front of camera. Yes, in a nutshell, the women who've made difference either through their acting prowess or perhaps by directing a strong narrative of a success story of some unknown character who later became a force to reckon with. And finally, in Globe Culture, we are going to take you through a museum of mankind in Paris. A museum, but with a much difference. It actually traces the evolution of mankind.
After 6 years of renovations, the Museum of Mankind in Paris reopened its doors this week, breathing a new life into France's leading anthropological museum. The museum contains some of the largest and most reputable collections of prehistoric artifacts in the world. 3 floors in the museum show the evolution of man, with 700,000 prehistoric items and 30,000 anthropological objects offering explanations on the origins of human diversity. These remarkable objects are presented in chronological order, from the skull of man's ancestor Cro-Magnon to that of French philosopher René Descartes, along with a gallery of 19th century busts representing human diversity in a modern way. The impact humans have had on their environment is shown with examples of a Mongolian hut and modern handmade objects. The museum answers 3 key questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going?
And this brings us to the end of this edition of World Connect. Do send us your feedbacks. You can write to us. Our first edition received overwhelming response from the viewers. We look forward to your suggestions and also to your feedbacks. Do write to us. Our email ID is worldconnect.ddnews@gmail.com. And before we wrap up, we leave you with the images of scenic and picturesque national parks of US. A film is being produced to celebrate the treasures of the country. Take a look. Goodbye and namaskar.